thing. Okay. So thank you everybody for coming to our webinar today. We're going to be talking about gardening with native flora for native fauna. My name is Gina Marie. I am the program director for Gratiot Lake Conservancy, and today I am also going to be presenting on this topic. So just a quick overview of what we're going to talk about today. We're going to talk about why this is important. Why do we want to be gardening with native plants? We're going to talk about how to get started planting a native garden. We'll touch on cultivars, where to buy your plants once you decide what plants you're going to plant, and just some basic gardening tasks by the season. At the very end, I'll list off some resources that I'll be sending out probably tomorrow or later this evening. And we'll end our session with some discussion time where we can share practical advice amongst gardeners, anecdotes, questions, things like that. I'm going to ask that you please save your questions for the end. You can pop them in the chat if you think you'll have trouble remembering your question. But just in the interest of time and the flow, I'm going to ask that you save them for the end. And without further ado, let's get started. So why do we want to garden with native plants? Probably the most obvious answer to that question is that native plants restore native habitat. Now, how do they do that? They provide food and shelter for native animals, especially insects and birds. And these plants on the landscape may ensure that the animals are better able to adapt to changes in the ecosystems up here. Persisting these food items and shelters for these animals are going to ensure that they are able to persist on our landscape. Another reason is that exotic plants that are so popular are often chosen because they are resistant to damage by insects and other so-called pests, such as rabbits or deer. But that is really disruptive to the food web. This is especially true for plants with red foliage, which we'll touch on a little bit later. But that all leads to a reduction of available food for native insectivores, especially. If there are no caterpillars able to munch on the plants, there's less food for insectivorous birds, especially in the spring. Native plants also typically require less maintenance once they are established. So in this way, native plant gardens are typically easier for us to manage. Many of the plants you work with in a native garden are perennial or at least self-seeding annuals. And because they are so well adapted to our native ecosystems, they don't require chemical fertilizers or herbicides. You'll never have to mow them, which is good for promoting cleaner air because there's less emissions from your lawnmower. And with a little strategy, you can also have a garden that doesn't require you to weed or really water it even that much. A lot of native plants can be quite drought tolerant, at least in comparison to your traditional lawn or garden. And this is going to save you money and conserve water. The final really important reason why we should be planting native plants is that they promote biodiversity on the landscape. You'll often hear lawns and traditional cottage type gardens referred to as ecological deserts, which kind of sounds harsh, but what that means is that these plants provide little to no benefit to our natural ecosystems. Really, their role is to be easy on our eyes. We plant them for aesthetic reasons. And that's true for gardens without native plants. You can consider some research by entomologist Doug Ptolemy. He concluded that native oak trees, so up here that would be a northern red oak, they can support over 550 native species of caterpillar. And caterpillars are a staple in avian diets, particularly in the spring. That can make up 96% of avian diets will have caterpillars in them. In comparison, commonly planted ornamental trees like ginkgo trees, which you see a lot in city landscaping, they support only 5 species of native caterpillars. So that's quite a stark difference. By planting native plants, we also are promoting biodiversity in the animal kingdom. So now that we have a better understanding of why native plants are so important, we might start considering how do we get started. And just in my conversations with people about native gardening, there seems to be kind of this intimidation surrounding it. And I'm not sure if that's because we're so used to planting exotics and, you see these lush cottage gardens. I don't want anybody to feel intimidated by starting a native plant garden. It doesn't have to be scary or even daunting to consider transitioning your existing garden spaces to a native garden or starting from scratch. And for example, here I have a picture of some maidenhair fern, and this is in a shade garden at my mom's house. And she really had no idea where to start with planting native plants, so she hired someone to come out and help her do that. They spent time together identifying plants that were already there and then talking about what native plants may be useful or would succeed in that environment. And so now she has this maidenhair fern that's just naturalizing in the shaded areas on her property. So here I just have some tips for starting out. I really think you can treat these spaces almost like any other garden. The main difference is that we're going to be a little more selective about what we're putting into it. And because the goal is to attract and support your native fauna, we want to be a little bit more relaxed when it comes to pest pressure. You want to be attracting insects that are going to munch on the leaves because those will support your wood warblers and other spring migrants that depend on them for their energy. You are going to want to see the deer and the rabbits in your garden. So really opening up that space to be the habitat that it can be for these native animals is important when considering a native garden. Another tip is that many native plants are now available commercially. I think even maybe a decade ago, it was a little harder to find native plants at greenhouses and other places. Now they're much more widely available. You just kind of need to know where to look and what to look for. We'll touch more on that in a little bit. And my third tip is to allow the garden time to fill in. You're working with a lot of perennials in this case, and they grow and spread more slowly than maybe some of the highly cultivated annual plants you may be used to dealing with if you've never planted perennials before. Especially Midwestern plants, they tend to have long and deep root systems, which is a really good thing, right? It means we'll conserve water in the garden in the long run because they'll be better able to access the groundwater. But they are going to spend a lot of energy the first 1 or 2 years developing their root systems. The old gardening adage, sleep, creep, and leap definitely apply here to native perennials. My last tip is that if at first you don't succeed, try again. I like to think of gardens as ongoing experiments. There's no gardener out there that has never killed a plant. You will probably kill plants. It's just part of gardening. But I like to view that as a learning experience. What works well and what doesn't work well in this particular space, or what can I do better next time? So those are some tips I want anybody considering to plant a native garden to keep in mind during their journey. So if you've never planned any garden before, you'll need to spend some time observing your space. Some things to consider are how much sun does your space get. If you get less than 6 hours of sun, you may need to consider shade tolerant plants, which is okay. There's lots of diversity for shade gardens as well. Other things to consider are your soil conditions. Are you on a xeric or a dry site, a mesic site, which is a site that has good drainage, but still a moderate amount of moisture? Or are you on a hydric site, which is a wet site? If you have a high water table, you might have some pretty mushy, wet soils. I deal with that certainly on my property. And what is your soil like? Is it clayey? Is it sandy? Or are you fortunate enough to be dealing with loamy soil, which a lot of plants prefer? And do you need to amend your soil? you can send a soil sample to your agricultural extension. They're not too expensive. It's maybe $25, I think. You can send in a sample and they'll tell you what like the nutrient profile is like, and they'll suggest amendments if you need them. But all of these are the building blocks for a healthy garden. Once you have made those observations, you can start making a plan. I like to define the space I'm working in as, the first step, because that will kind of inform how many plants I can support and where they are going. And having that background information will help prevent me from overbuying or overstarting plants, which obviously conserves resources and money. If you're not like, buying a bunch of plants that then don't have homes. Once I know which space I'm working in and what the conditions are like, I can start choosing a plant. And after we choose plants, we can consider where we're going to buy them and whether or not we're going to start from seed or buy starts. Starting from seed can save you a little bit of money, but it's often more time consuming and a little more difficult, especially with a lot of native perennials. They need some extra care when starting from seed. And buying starts, you're going to put a little bit more money into it, but it might be a little less work, a little easier. Unless that particular plant doesn't like being transplanted. There's also, you can do what my mom did here in her front garden. You can see there's some non-native plants here in the foreground, and then a ton of common milkweed is just starting to take over, and she's just letting that milkweed slowly drive out all these other plants because her approach is a little more hands-off, and that works too. I let native plants volunteer in my gardens all the time. Whenever I see them, I let them grow. So when we've gotten to the point of choosing our plants, you're going to want to ensure they're actually native to your area. I would caution anybody to be wary of claims on seed packets or websites or even seed catalogs that any given plant is native. All plants are native somewhere, but we want to make sure that we are growing plants that are native to our particular area to provide the biggest benefit for our native ecosystems. Here, I have an example of a seed packet from my own collection, and it's common marshmallow, and they're claiming that it's a native perennial plant. And if you are familiar with native and non-native plants, you might already know that common marshmallow is native to Europe and Western Asia and North Africa. It is not native to North America. So what I suspect happened in this instance is that common marshmallow has naturalized pretty well where they are, which is New York, I think in the Finger Lakes area. And so it's just simply confusion or a misconception on their part. So one good resource to double check your information is the USDA plants database. And I'm going to jump over to their website, which may mean I need to pause my sharing. So just hang on tight. There may be a slight bump in the road as we get going here. All right. Whoops. Almost there. All right, you should be able to see my screen now. Can someone just give me a thumbs up to make sure? Can we see the screen? Awesome, thank you. All right. So I really love the USDA plants database when I'm trying to confirm whether or not a particular plant is actually native to my county, which is Houghton County. And I'm going to take you through a few examples. Here is the search bar, and you can actually search by common name or scientific name. Just make sure you have the correct drop-down menu selected. I'm going to use a scientific name because for these examples, I know them. So for example, let's do Rudbeckia hirta, which you may know as black-eyed Susan. When you select the correct plant from the results, it takes you to a page dedicated to that plant. There's some general information, and then some fact sheets and guides, which are helpful. But the main reason I love this resource is because you can scroll down to this map, it'll pop up. Oh, please load. Let's try here. Well, what a shame, my map's not loading. But there is a map here, and you can zoom in and out on the map, and it will actually tell you down to the county whether or not that plant is native. And I do want to stress that plants do not subscribe to our political borders. So if there's a plant that, if you're in Houghton County and there's a plant that's native to, say, Kuna County or Ontonagon County, that's probably close enough. My other example was going to be purple coneflower. Which you may also know as echinacea. And purple coneflower is native to Michigan, I believe, in only a few counties, but it's not actually native to Houghton County. You can certainly plant it. I do. It just may not be the most beneficial plant for our own natural native ecosystems. So let me hop over. I had another resource I would like to share. And that's the Audubon Native Plants database. And this one is really great if you really have no idea where you want to start, or maybe you're not really familiar with what plants are actually native. You can go here and plug in your email and a 5-digit zip code, and they will come up with a list of plants that are native to that zip code. I'm going to do 49950, which is the zip code for Mohawk, and Gratiot Lake also shares that zip code. So we hit our search button, and the first thing it's going to show you are your quote unquote best results. And they claim these have been hand selected by Audubon experts for our region. One important thing to note is it's the Audubon Society, right? So they're very interested in bird resources. So a lot of these plants are going to attract birds. That's kind of what they focused on. But the best results are also going to be plants that are relatively easy to grow and readily available. There are some drop-down menus on this page. You can select annuals and perennials, grasses, etc. You can even select for the resources you want to provide on your property. Maybe you want to start a nectary, or maybe you want to provide more hard mast nuts and seeds, which benefit not only birds, but some small mammals. Maybe you want to attract butterflies. You can select for that in these lists. You can also hone down which kind of birds you want to attract. Maybe it's hummingbirds or wood warblers. You can select that if you want. So let's just go down here and see what they've come up with. Here's serviceberry, and they have some information about the plant here and attributes. So this would show up if you wanted to plant shrubs or trees, if you want to provide fruit, and it also attracts butterflies and caterpillars. And then they have a list of birds that it may attract. So we can scroll over and see this tree is really good for attracting a lot of different birds. So let's add that to our plant list. And just for the sake of example, let's also add alternate leaf dogwood and basswood. And down here, you can see it's compiling a list for us. If I click get your plant list, I have the option to send a list of the plants I want to my email address that I provided at the beginning. They also provide local resources. So these are places you can go for more information about native plants, or even where to buy some native plants. So that's kind of a neat resource. It's a little limited. There are way more places to buy native plants than just the Borealis Seed Company in Marquette. But we'll talk more about that a little later. So let me hop back over to my PowerPoint. Bear with me here. All right, now we're back in. So one thing we want to keep in mind when we're choosing our plants is that we want to pick plants that are going to succeed in our gardens based upon the observations we made earlier. So are we dealing with a shaded spot or a full sun spot? What are the soil conditions? Again, is it dry or well drained or wet? Here I have two pictures. This is some native plant landscaping outside of the Field Museum in Chicago. So that's a very open spot. Obviously, they get a lot of sun, and I'm guessing the soil is maintained and irrigated. So I would, consider that a mesic, well-drained site. And then here, this is a picture of my 2-acre pond on my property, which is obviously a lot different, right, than growing plants in a cityscape. So for our native plant project here, we've been lucky enough to grow wild rice. And here's just kind of a short list of plants that would do well in the full sun, well-drained site in Houghton County. I just kind of wanted to highlight the diversity that there really is when doing a native plant garden. I think sometimes people tend to think when they can no longer wish to plant exotics that they may have fewer choices, and I really don't think that's true. There are lots of choices out there. You'll see here gray-headed coneflower says Keweenaw County. If you bring up gray-headed coneflower on the USDA plant database, it will tell you it's not native to Houghton County. But again, plants don't subscribe to our political borders. So I would say Keweenaw County is probably close enough. And I can bring this up again at the end if people wanted to jot these plants down. And here's an example for a shade garden in Houghton County. I want to highlight doll's eyes, also known as baneberry. That is a toxic plant. So if you have pets or children outside, it might not be the best choice, but there's still a lot of diversity out there for a shade garden too. And again, I can bring this up at the end if we want to. So another important thing to consider when planting a native garden are cultivars versus the wild type. And to open up that conversation, we really have to understand what we're talking about. A cultivar is simply a plant variety that has been produced by selective breeding. Typically, these plants are selected for aesthetic characteristics like double flowers or foliage color, things like that. And the wild type is just the plant variety that is phenotypically true. So that means it looks like the species as it occurs in nature. And here I have a picture of, this is Echinacea purpurea, purple coneflower, but you'll notice that the petals aren't purple. They're this pretty like sunset orange color. That's because that's a cultivar. This variety has been selected for these pretty orangey sunset colors. I think it's called Paradiso mix. And I chose that plant because I wanted coneflower, but I couldn't, all like the purple coneflower seeds were sold out. So I went with the next best thing, which was this mix that's just a different color. You may also hear the term nativar, and that's simply the words native and cultivar sandwiched together. It means a native plant that has been cultivated for preferred characteristics. Here's another example of that. This is Dyer's coreopsis, not native to Houghton County. I have it in my garden as a dye plant. I like to dye wool. And it's just been selected to have all red petals, whereas the wild type would have both yellow and red on the petal. And to drive it home, here's another example from my own garden. These are both Black-Eyed Susan. On the left here, we have the cultivar Goldilocks, which has this really beautiful double flower form. And then on the right, we have the wild type, which is single. Just as pretty, it's just not as full. And I'll just let the wild type spring up anywhere it wants on my property because I'm still, going through my cultivated seed packet. So why do we need to be cognizant of this issue with cultivars, there are some potential problems that can arise when planting them. Sometimes those complicated petal structures, like here with this Rudbeckia, that can sometimes make it more difficult for pollinators to access pollen, or insects and birds that like to eat nectar. It can make that access more difficult for them to. And then there's also pollenless varieties you should be watching out for. I have sunflower here as an example. Sunflowers aren't native to Houghton County, but I wanted to use them as an example because it's so prevalent in sunflowers. People like to plant sunflowers for cut flowers, which has led to a lot of hybrids that produce pollenless blooms. And obviously a pollenless flower is not going to have food for our native pollinators. And it's also not going to produce usable seeds for birds or small mammals that are going to want to eat seeds. The other thing to watch out for is unpalatable foliage, which we touched on a little bit at the beginning. This is particularly red foliage, which is common in some 9-bark cultivars. It doesn't support insects. There's a lot of anthocyanins in them, and that makes it kind of bitter. And they just don't like to munch on it as much. It doesn't support their life cycle very well, and therefore it's not going to support any of our insectivorous birds. So all this to say, you can certainly plant nativars. I just like to be really selective with the ones that I do plant. I kind of ask myself the question, will this plant support my life cycle, my life pathways? Is it going to be usable for my offspring? Questions like that. And if the answer is no, I might try to find a different plant. So once you have your plant list, you are going to start considering whether you're going to start from seed or by starts, and where are you actually going to get them. Again, seeds are a little bit more work, but they can be cheaper. You can get more plants for less money. Starts are a little more expensive, but they can save you time. And they, it's a little easier to start from a 6 cell than it is to start from a tiny seed. But seeds are certainly doable. Here I have a picture from my own garden. Here's gray-headed coneflower, bone set, and blue vervain. I started all of that from seed this year, and it's filling in nicely. If you want to start from seed, I just put together a quick short list of places I like to look for seeds. There's Fruition Seeds. They did have that boo-boo with the marshmallow, but everything else pretty much checks out, and I like them because the seeds are from organic stock, and they are adapted to zone 5, which is the zone my house is in. So the plants are a little, they're adapted for this climate and therefore are more vigorous here. They have seed packets of individual species. So if you wanted to start bone set from seed, for example, you could buy some seeds from Fruition and have success. There's also Seed Savers Exchange. They offer mixes for scattering. We can touch on that in a little bit, or seed packets of individual species. Prairie Moon Nursery is another good one. They're in Minnesota. They do mixes for scattering and seed packets. There's also Prairie Nursery, Wisconsin. Again, they do mixes for scattering and seed packets. And one thing I really like about Prairie Nursery is they have pre-planned gardens. So if you're working in a shaded site or a full sun site, you can go on their website and select that, and they will just pop up a list of plants like pre-planned for you. So it saves you a lot of work. If you're gonna go with starts, I think it's best to kind of start your search locally and broaden out from there. You can order from local plant sales. I know Houghton County Conservation District does one, and Wild Ones Keweenaw chapter does one. Marcia Goodrich from Wild Ones is here, and I'm kind of hoping during our discussion she might tell us a little bit about how the plant sales with Wild Ones works. And I think the cool thing about ordering from a local organization is that that money is then going to support the native ecosystems outside of your own property, right? You're contributing money in exchange for these plants to these organizations that can then use those funds to support our local ecosystems. Another avenue you can go is through local nurseries. I know Dennis in Lake Linden has some availability of native plants. There's also a little further afield, Designs by Nature, UP Native Plants, based in Marquette. And what's really cool about them is they start all of their plants from UP seed. And so those plants are adapted to our climate already. They're gonna survive the harsh conditions we often go through in the winter. So that's another really good resource. And if you are, not around here and you need to find someone else and you can't find a nursery that already carries native plants, you can talk to them and see if they'll do a special order for you. If they know there's interest and if people start buying native plants, that means that they are going to be more apt to supply them and more people can buy them. And the whole supply and demand thing will work itself out and more people will be getting native plants into their gardens. If none of that works out, you can start thinking about ordering like mail order from nurseries. Prairie Moon Nursery does this and so does Prairie Nursery. And like I said, Prairie Nursery has pre-planned gardens, which could save you a lot of work in the beginning if you are still feeling maybe intimidated by choosing your own plants. Once you have your plant list and you know where you're going to buy your seeds or your starts, you can start gardening. And here I've just laid out some basic tasks by season. And the fall is a good time to amend your soil or do any sheet mulching you want to do. This is when you want to spread your seed mixes. If you buy a seed mix and you spread it out in July, you probably are not going to be very successful. The seeds in those mixes need the right conditions and the right amount of time to break the dormancy of the seed. It's especially true in northern climates. A lot of those plants need a cold, moist period to break their dormancy. And that kind of leads into your winter tasks. This is when I like to stratify my seeds that I have in seed packets. I'll touch more on that in a little bit. In the spring, you can start your seeds or order your starts and start hardening off your transplants and getting them ready to go out in your garden. After your last frost, and into the summer, you can be transplanting your starts. And in a first year garden, you probably are still going to have some weeding until those plants really get established and just general maintenance. We've been really droughty, so I've had to supplement water this year. So a little bit more about sheet mulching. This is how I like to start a new garden space without tilling. So there's the existing soil and then I just have grass and weeds on top, right? And so I skip this compost layer and I just layer my cardboard right over it. You want it to overlap, and that way it will kill your weeds and your grass, but it will allow that vegetation to decompose and add organic matter back to your existing soil. And for me, that's really important because I deal with a lot of clay, especially in my front yard. I have clayey soil, so I want that organic matter in there to start helping break that up and add, again, organic matter and nutrients back to the soil. I do top my cardboard with compost and sometimes like wood chip mulch too. If you're doing this in the fall, after your last frost, you could spread your seed mixes here, and that would give those seeds some time to stratify. You want to make sure it's after your last frost though, because fall can be kind of a wet time and you don't want your seeds to rot. In the winter, that's a really good time to stratify your seeds. If you skip this step, you may not be very successful, especially with plants like milkweed. They really need that cool, moist period to break the dormancy of the seed. So what I like to do around the new year is stratify my seeds. And what I do is I layer them in a damp, not wet, but damp paper towel and put that in a Ziploc bag. You could certainly use a silicone bag to avoid the plastic. And then I put that in my fridge for about a month before I start them in seed starting trays. Another thing you can do is just wait until you see exposed soil. I think I took this picture in March, maybe early April, and you can just scatter if you missed it in the fall, you can scatter seeds on that bare soil at that time. Once you have starts, you can start hardening them off in the early spring. The reason you want to make sure you do this is because these plants have likely been babied their entire life. You know, they've been in your house or in a greenhouse, and they've not been exposed to the elements or wide temperature swings. And they need to get used to that before you just plop them in the ground. So that's a really important step. You want to, at least 2 weeks, give them time to harden off. You may have to bring them back inside a couple times if it gets too harsh out there. And if they're frost hardy varieties, you may be able to start transplanting a little bit before your final frost, but only if you've made sure to harden them off really well. And in the late spring and early summer, you can really start, planting all of these plants and doing your general maintenance. So finally, I'd just like to touch on some resources for thinking about native gardening. Locally here, we have the Wild Ones Kuna chapter, and I want to thank them for helping get the word out about our talk today. There's also the Audubon Native Plant Database and the USDA Native Plant Database, and I'll be sending links out to these resources either this evening or tomorrow for all participants. There's Prairie Nursery. They have a lot on their website, like the pre-planned gardens and just information about how to get started with native plants. You can also read some books. There's Doug Ptolemy is a popular author on this topic. And then there's Nancy Lawson. I believe she spoke at the Wild Ones. The name is escaping me right now. They had a native plant symposium and she spoke at that. So I'll send out some links at the end of the day or tomorrow for these resources. And now I would like to open it up to questions or general discussion. We can share anecdotes or tips and tricks, stuff like that. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen and get back to the gallery view. And I have to let my dog in really quick. She's kind of yelping at the door. So just give me one moment, please.